everyone. We're delighted to see you all here. This is the second event in the inaugural Orwell Festival of Political Writing, which we're presenting in conjunction with our sponsors, the London Review of Books, Substack, and the Institute of Advanced Study here at University College. And we're very grateful to them for their support. We've got a fantastic panel here to discuss the topic of Bismarck and political power. And what I'm going to do is introduce them all briefly to start with, and then each of our speakers will speak for around 10 minutes, and then we'll have something of a panel discussion, I expect, before we throw it open to you for questions. So let me introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Professor Sir Richard Evans is Regius Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Cambridge, a former president of Wolfson College and a fellow of the British Academy. He's one of the world's leading historians on 19th and 20th century Europe and has written very extensively about Germany, about German society, politics, health, capital punishment, and is probably best known to general readers for his magisterial 3-volume history of the Third Reich. In 2000, Richard was an expert witness in the High Court in London in the case of David Irving against Deborah Lipstadt. Deborah Lipstadt. David Irving had sued Deborah Lipstadt because she'd asserted in a book published by Penguin that he was a Holocaust denier. Rather sadly for David Irving, the judge agreed with Deborah Lipstadt and concluded that the statement she'd made about Irving was true. And that was no doubt in large part because of the evidence given by Richard. And Richard wrote about this trial in a book that was rather pleasingly titled, in the UK at least, Telling Lies about Hitler. Thank you very much for being here, Richard. Katja Hoye is an Anglo-German historian. She was born in East Germany. She graduated from the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena, and she writes for The Spectator, Die Welt, Unheard, and is a foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Post. In 2021, she published Blood and Steel, which is an account of the German Empire from 1871 until 1918. She took the title, of course, from the famous speech that Bismarck made in 1862 when he said, "Great decisions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron." Andrew Roberts described this book as the best book about the Second Reich in years, and Neil MacGregor described it as splendidly lucid. You're presently working, I think, on an account of the German Democratic Republic, which is hoped to publish next year under the provisional title The Other Side of the Wall, or Beyond the Wall. Beyond the Wall. Katja is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a visiting research fellow at King's College, London. Dominic Cummings is that rare thing, a political strategist of the first rank who became a political actor of the first rank. Among his famously wide range of interests has been a focus on the political genius of Bismarck and lessons, ramifications of that genius for contemporary political practice. Who better to speak of perhaps the greatest strategist come actor of the 19th century, and some might say of any century since, than someone who successfully strategized changes in the constellation of nation states and then entered government himself. Gideon Rachman joined the Financial Times in 2006 as the FT's chief foreign affairs commentator after 15 years at The Economist with postings in Brussels, Washington, and Bangkok. He's become a highly respected voice on United States foreign policy, the European Union, globalization, its ramifications, advances, retreats, and implications. In 2016, he published his second book, Easternization, War and Peace in the Asian Century. This book was described by the British historian Paul Kennedy as a work that should be read by every leading political figure. Gideon was a visiting fellow at what was then called the William Woodrow School in Princeton, and also a visiting fellow at the Nobel Institute in Oslo. In 2016, he won the Orwell Prize for journalism. So thank you all very much for being here. We look forward to what you have to say with great interest. And Richard, over to you to start.
Thanks very much. Everybody hear me? Great, good. So, we're discussing Otto von Bismarck, mainly because Dominic has raised the question repeatedly of how we can use the great German statesman's words and deeds to help political decision-making in the present. So let me begin by reminding you all who Bismarck was and what he did. So born in 1815, a nobleman descended from the landed and bureaucratic hereditary aristocracy of Prussia, which was a medium-sized northeast European state at a time when Germany had not yet been united, but was split up into 39 independent entities varying in size from the Kingdom of Bavaria, the Kingdom of Saxony, to tiny cabbage patch principalities like Schwarzburg, Rudolstadt, which nobody quite rightly has ever heard of. By far the most important of these states in the first half of the 19th century was Austria, ruled by the Habsburgs, leading power in the overthrow of French Emperor Napoleon. Prussia was a military state. It's described by one French statesman as not a country with an army, but an army with a country. It was monarchical, undemocratic, authoritarian, militaristic, bureaucratic in the real sense of the word, ruled by appointed officials. In 1815, its role in Napoleon's defeat was rewarded with a sizable chunk of territory in the Rhineland. This eventually made it much more powerful because it soon became the powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution in Germany, the area called the Ruhr, for example, was in the Prussian Rhineland. And with the rapid growth of the liberal middle classes came the 1848 revolution. Although the revolution founded on its own contradictions, it left Prussia with an elected parliament. We all think of 1848 as a failure, but in fact it forced on Prussia an elected parliament, dominated by liberals, a parliament that soon tried to increase its power by rejecting the state budget, from which, of course, the army was funded. The liberals wanted a kind of militia under parliamentary control. The Prussian king, Wilhelm I, rigidly, desperately rejected that idea, and in this situation, the king called in Bismarck as the head of the government, tasked with somehow preserving the state's authoritarian institutions, and especially the independence of his army from civilian control. Now, Bismarck was notoriously an extreme conservative. Calling him to head the government was rather like calling Jacob Rees-Mogg to be Prime Minister today. He was just as reactionary as Rees-Mogg, but he had a brain. Bismarck was willing to break the rules, and he did so, spending the state's revenues, especially on the army, without parliamentary approval. But he could see that social and political trends favoured the liberals. And it was clear too that they wanted to unify Germany, as they tried unsuccessfully to do in 1848, on the basis of a liberal parliamentary constitution that would have destroyed the traditional Prussian constitution Bismarck was determined to defend. So what he did was to unify Germany, but without Habsburg Austria. And that's because the Habsburgs they ruled what's now Austria and what's now the Czech Republic. That was all part of a kind of German confederation inherited from earlier centuries. But they also had a large amount of territory, like Hungary, which wasn't German at all, it wasn't in Germany. So they were committed to keeping all of that. It just was kind of squaring the circle. And so Bismarck engineered a short war with Austria, which ended with a complete defeat of the Habsburg forces and the creation of a North German Confederation in 1867, because the South German states backed Austria, in which a virtually unchanged Prussia was the dominant power. And then, provoking a war with France by subterfuge, by famously a kind of misreporting an encounter between the King, William I, and French ambassador, in which he made it seem that the king had been extremely rude to the French ambassador. And France, of course, under Napoleon III, was fearful of a new German Reich. The French, too, were crushed in 1871. To add insult to injury, Bismarck then inaugurated the new German Reich, the German Empire, in a ceremony held in the Palace of Versailles. This is what you might call Bismarck Mark I. Bold, ruthless, willing to take huge risks. From 1871 until his enforced resignation in 1890, he was cautious and conservative. In both cases, that's Bismarck Mark II, as it were. In both cases, he based his policies on the recognition that you couldn't hold back history. The art of statesmanship, he said, was to steer a course on the stream of time, not to try and dam it or reverse it. Liberal nationalism was where politics were headed in the 1860s, so he moulded it to his own conservative purposes rather than trying to defeat it. Now, unlike Disraeli and Napoleon III, comparable figures, I think, in many ways in Britain and France, who used radical means to conservative ends, Bismarck tried to undermine the liberals, who were a middle-class elite who depended on essentially limited political participation, and he tried to counter them, undermine them by extending voting rights, just like Disraeli and Napoleon III had done. In Bismarck's case, he gave the vote to all adult males in the New Germany, since he considered the mass of the population in the countryside would remain loyal to the monarchy. In 1866, he'd also held back the army from occupying Vienna after defeating the Habsburgs, where the generals all gung-ho wanted to march on Vienna, and Bismarck had a huge fight and said, no, this mustn't happen, because he knew that Germany in the future would need Austria as an ally. But there's no chance of this happening with France, of course, so his policies in the 1870s and 80s were based on the knowledge that the new German Empire needed consolidation and protection by a series of alliances that would somehow hold back the French and prevent them from seeking revenge. For almost all this time, Bismarck enjoyed the support of the Prussian king, who then became German emperor. This is William I, an elderly soldier type, and the Prussian kings came in sort of two types. There was the soldier type, who just wanted to play about with armies and have wars and things, and then there was a kind of mad aesthete type, like Frederick William IV, or William II, and Frederick the Great was great because he sort of combined both. But Wilhelm was the military type, and he once said, it's rather hard being king under Bismarck. So he kind of followed what Bismarck wanted. But when Wilhelm's bumptious and erratic grandson came to the throne as Wilhelm II, a man who lacked Bismarck's awareness of how precarious Germany's position was, the two clashed, and Bismarck was basically forced to resign. There's a famous cartoon by Tenniel called Dropping the Pilot, where you can see the ship, Bismarck sort of trundling down the gangway, looking a bit fed up, and Wilhelm II is smirking and looking really casually and pleasing himself on the ship. The issue at stake here was the clampdown Bismarck had begun in 1878 on the Marxist Social Democrats. He wanted to continue that because it didn't. Here's a question on which Bismarck's realism failed him. The rapid industrialization of Germany brought a fast-growing industrial working class, which took advantage of universal male suffrage to vote for the Social Democrats. So Bismarck branded them traitors to the Reich and tried to suppress them. He failed completely. When Germany lost the First World War, eventually the Social Democrats came to power in a revolution, sweeping away the old Prussian institutions and founding the Weimar Republic. Almost as bad, he failed to recognize that in South Germany, where opposition to unification had been strong, the Catholic Church, representing the great majority, would resist a takeover by the state, owing their allegiance to the Pope. So, in other words, the Pope and the Church were in charge of, say, appointing bishops and so on, whilst Bismarck wanted the state to have a say in appointing bishops, and horror of horror, he wanted the clergy also to learn history in the part of their training. The Pope at precisely this time, Pius IX in the 1870s, was extending his own power over the Church with the proclamation of papal infallibility and syllabus of errors. So the discrimination Bismarck applied to the Catholics, it was severe. I mean, lots of Social Democrats and Catholic clergy were jailed during this time, 1870s and 80s. And this created a baleful precedent, which not much more than half a century later, Hitler applied to the communists, Social Democrats again, and to a degree to the Catholics as well. Branding an entire community, millions of people, as an enemy of the Reich had too easily become part of German political culture, thanks to Bismarck. So his realism had its limits. Stream of time, in other words, didn't always flow in the direction that he predicted. Can we learn any lessons from Bismarck? Well, certainly you might say that his example teaches us if a political leader is confronted by an apparently insoluble problem, like the Prussian budgetary clash of the 1860s, or if I can draw a parallel, the seeming impossibility of getting Brexit done under Theresa May, then one way of getting it through is to cut the Gordian knot. And incidentally, that image, of course, tells you that even Alexander the Great disobeyed the rules, as it were, in order to get what he wanted. It's not a new thing. But in other words, breaking the rules, throwing convention out of the window. And that's what Bismarck did in the 1860s and 1870s, 71. But his example also shows that short-term problem solving can bring with it long-term problems as well. Already in the 1890s, many Germans, encouraged by Bismarck out of office himself, admired him for kind of the wrong reasons. The Iron Chancellor, aggressive, militaristic, addicted to power, rather than the man who, between 1870 and 1890, pursued a foreign policy that recognized Germany's weaknesses and attempted to preserve the peace in Europe. The Social Democratic Chancellor earlier in the late 20th century, Helmut Schmidt, used to say there were two Bismarcks, and the one that he admired was the statesman of the 1880s and 1890s in terms of foreign policy, not the earlier one. Can we turn to Bismarck and ask what he would have done if he was confronted by an apparently insoluble problem in the present? This is more difficult, I think. The past, as we know, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Bismarck was a man of his time. I don't think he would have had the faintest clue of what to do in the 21st century. In fact, in 1888, when he attended the opening of the vast new free harbour facilities built in Hamburg, Germany's biggest port, for the city's belated accession to the German Customs Union, and when he saw the steam cranes, the dry docks, huge warehouses, the loading and unloading machinery, he turned to his hosts, the city senators, and said, "Gentlemen, this is a world I no longer understand." Thank you.
Gotcha.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Good. I want to start my remarks by committing perhaps a minor act of blasphemy in these hallowed halls of Orwell enthusiasts to say that I think Orwell's judgment of Bismarck was wrong. I know I'm going to leave through the back door quietly after this talk. But I think it's worth looking at them in the context of when they were written. So when Orwell heavily criticized Bismarck for his policy towards France, and this is the bit that I want to focus on, he wrote those remarks in May 1944, and that's worth bearing in mind. So Orwell is, sat there at the sort of latter stage of the worst human conflict there had ever been. He's looking at 5 years of war at that point that brought devastation to Eastern Europe on a scale that had just not existed previously. And he's looking, like many intellectuals, for answers. Where did this come from? Why did this happen? How can this prevent it from happening again? And also the fact that the war hadn't finished yet, and there's still, Orwell obviously doesn't know that at this point, but there's still over, just about a year to go at this point. So I think we need to see that in this context, but what he's trying to do is look back in history for the reason why this happened, and the event that he identifies as the sort of the turning point, really, which set all of these events in motion, is the Franco-Prussian War that Richard just mentioned in 1870, and which was sort of concluded in 1871. And Orwell, in this article, which was also quoted from in the brochure for this talk, specifically talks about a conversation between General de Wimpfen and Otto von Bismarck. So de Wimpfen basically argued on behalf of the French for a lenient peace, and Bismarck was holding back against that and was saying, no, we can't give you a lenient peace. As much as I'd like to, that's not going to happen, and I tell you why. And Orwell looks at that conversation and says, this is the problem, this is where it all started. So I think it's worth going back there for me to tell you why I think he's wrong with that assessment. So in that conversation with Bismarck, the French had just been defeated at the Battle of Sedan in September 1870, very decisively so, and therefore this was going to be a huge humiliation, and de Wimpfen is basically trying to make this less bad, as it were, by negotiating for mild terms. And he says to Bismarck, and I quote, "This is in your interest from a political standpoint to grant us honourable conditions." So de Wimpfen is arguing for a mild peace because a mild peace, in his view, is durable. And he says, quote, "Rigorous measures would awaken bad passions and perhaps bring on an endless war between France and Prussia." And that's the bit that Orwell looks at and thinks, okay, this is where it started. This enmity between France and Germany leads to the First World War, and then the fallout from that leads to the Second World War. Bismarck's response to that is that he says, and again I quote, "We might build on the gratitude of a prince, but certainly not on the gratitude of a people, least of all on the gratitude of the French," which sounds more spiteful than it is. What he was trying to get at is that the French at this point, when you think where we are at this point in time in 1870, had gone through loads of different governments. He looks at basically going back to the French Revolution at this point nearly a century ago, and he sees a monarchy going down, radically so, with the king being executed, followed by an extremely radical and violent and volatile form of republicanism. Then you end up with Napoleon as the emperor, you go back to monarchy, back to republicanism, back to monarchy, back to republicanism. And he's basically saying, de Wimpfen, that's all well and nice that you say this to me, but you give me a promise now. Who's to say that the French people, like next month don't have a different government? That will say something else to me. I need to make sure that peace lasts by giving you a harsh peace so that you can't immediately fight back. Orwell looks at that kind of conversation and calls Bismarck's argument, and I quote again, "an imbecile speech," which I think isn't the case, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And he also says that, and again I quote here, "Harsh terms then meant terrible defeat 48 years later. Such is realism." And you can almost hear the cynicism out of that, sitting there in 1944 and thinking, if only Bismarck had listened to the French and had given in and had given them a slightly more lenient peace, we wouldn't be where we are. I think the problem with that is that the same logic is still applied today. So when you look at the Ukraine-Russia conflict, where again many people argue, particularly on the German left, for example, that a lenient peace towards Russia now will bring about long-lasting peace because it won't humiliate Russia even. Freudian slip here. I can't get my mind out of the 19th century. But the same argument applies, and I think it's just as dangerous as the logic that Orwell applied in 1944. First of all, Franco-Prussian animosity did not originate in 1870. And to think that it could have been ended at that point by a lenient peace is therefore naive, to say the least. The terms that Bismarck eventually imposes point to that element of it. So he basically charges the French 5 billion francs in terms of indemnity payments for this war, and that is calculated to be the exact same amount that Napoleon charged the Prussians in 1807. So to think that 1870 came out of nowhere and that was the point at which things could have been turned around, when Bismarck and the Prussians, and by extension the Germans, are sitting there looking back to 1807 as their example of revanchism, just shows what a long history of kind of animosity there was. And Bismarck simply accepted that animosity as a fact. He couldn't change it, so it needed to be managed rather than mitigated. It's also worth pointing out that that Peace of Tilsit in 1807 between Napoleon and the Prussians came about in an incredibly humiliating manner for the Prussians. So Napoleon had basically pushed the Prussian king all the way to the edge of his realm, to the Baltics, nearly out of Berlin, had then nicked the quadriga of the Brandenburg Gate and taken it to Paris in a great triumphal procession, left that one, there's like a sort of iron rod that holds the quadriga in place, and he left that there deliberately to needle Berlin, quite literally. So the Berliners were looking at this kind of empty Brandenburg Gate every day, you know, to just remind them of the humiliation they'd just gone through. And as if that wasn't enough, Napoleon then negotiated not with the king, but with the king's formidable wife, Louise, and called her the only man in Prussia. Which was as much, of course, a compliment to that formidable woman as it was an attempt to emasculate the king himself and humiliate him in front of the whole of Europe. So for Orwell to assume that all of that had been forgotten by 1870 is naive, and it would have been wrong to assume that a lenient peace on France would have been taken lightly and easily on the German side. You would have had just as much resentment on that side, building a new state from scratch, with the kind of bitterness of that defeat of 1807 not resolved. Just to give you one example how important that still is in the German mind, the colours, the tricolour that Germany still uses today, comes out of the Napoleonic Wars. It is based on the uniforms of one of the Freikorps units, the volunteer units that fought on the Prussian side. Basically the uniform was black and it had brass buttons where the gold comes from and sort of red lining on it, and that's how important this is to Germany as a nation and as a nation state. And for people to forget that by 1870, that was just not happening. There was a huge nationalist clamour there that Bismarck had to deal with at home as well. On top of that, the peace was relatively manageable for the French, so they paid off that indemnity payment early, within 2 years. So after 2 years in 1873, they were done. Basically, it was all paid off, and the French economy took off again, as did the German economy on the other side. And nobody at this point thought that in a few years' time, a few decades' time, the horrendous 2 wars that ensued were to come. To draw a straight line from there to the First World War and then to the Second World War, I think absolves an awful lot of people of an awful lot of responsibility. So I think this is important to note. I mean, the only mistake in this, and perhaps we can talk about this in the questions later, I think was the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine. That was an unnecessary slight, I think, on the part of Germany towards France. Bismarck knew that and appreciated it and didn't want that to happen for that exact reason. But the problem was that Alsace of the two was majority German, and therefore German nationalists were sort of clamoring for that to be annexed, and Bismarck found himself in a situation where he sort of caved to that. How this applies to today, I think, and where we can draw lessons from Bismarck's realism rather than Orwell's, I think in this case, somewhat wishful thinking that lenient peace is always a durable peace, is that I'm very, very worried about the rhetoric that comes from people like Emmanuel Macron, for example, about this idea that if we don't humiliate Russia, it will lead to a lenient and long-lasting sort of peace that will appease Russia. It's the same sort of logic that Russia has been provoked over the last 30 years with NATO expansion and so on and so forth. It's just, to me, the same sort of logic as Orwell looking back a few decades rather than a century or so. Whilst there's Putin standing there comparing himself to Peter the Great, with ambitions obviously going far beyond the kind of disputed regions in Ukraine. So I think from that angle, the lessons to be learned here are that animosity between states and ambitions of states exist, and they cannot necessarily just be appeased with this kind of short-term solution. I think long-term solutions need to be found, and sometimes we'll just have to accept the unpalatable reality that states are in a sort of semi-permanent state of animosity towards each other, and we need to find ways of managing that rather than pandering to it. And I think I'll leave that here for now.
Thank you, Catherine. Dominic.
Can people hear me okay if I speak like this? So I'll say a few things just about some very simple characteristics of Bismarck and about political performance. And then I'll say something about one aspect of his approach to international relations that I think is relevant to today, and then how these two things are connected a little bit. If you watch normal human competitions like sports or chess, the difference between the top players in ability is small. That's what makes it exciting. Even Tiger Woods or Roger Federer often get beaten. But now we can watch games between AI systems and the best humans in chess. When we look at these games, you can see some beauty, we can understand some of what's happening, but we also know there's this vast world of calculation to which we have no access. And in detail, the output of this intelligence is almost all mysterious to us. And the closest we have to this kind of experience in politics is looking at the career of Bismarck. He's clearly someone playing on a different level to the other players, not just a little bit better, but really completely differently. And the more that you kind of follow all the twists and turns and the details, then the more you appreciate just what a different sort of game he was playing. Now, of course, there are other characters in history like Alexander the Great or Caesar that you could say maybe they're equivalent sort of people, but you don't have sources for people like that. People like Richard and Katya can't delve into the detail and see exactly what they're doing. Here you have someone who's a world historical changing character that you can actually trace day to day, often, sometimes even hour to hour, exactly what they're doing. And you can learn an awful lot about that. With him, we can see very clearly what Charlie Munger calls the unrecognized simplicities of effective action. A few quite abstract principles that are very simple to state, very powerful, but almost entirely unrecognized and untrained. First of all, he had a very extreme courage to face reality. He tried to very hard not to fool himself about himself, and not to fool himself about what other people were doing. Secondly, he had a very extreme epistemological skepticism. He understood that no human can understand much of our complex world. The interaction of material forces, ideas, institutions, individuals, that we're inevitably constantly surprised by the incalculable chance events, by crises that spin out of control because someone gets drunk or falls in love or keels over with a heart attack. These things are always happening, and he had an incredible feel for this. Everybody in politics, he said, is like a child walking in the dark. I'm not so arrogant as to assume that the likes of us are able to make history. My task is to keep an eye on the currents and steer my ship in them as best I can. The currents themselves I cannot direct, even less am I able to create them. Third, he had an extreme ability to see his own most cherished beliefs with a cold distance. Everybody in politics is something of a sorcerer's apprentice, but almost nobody in politics really sees themselves like this, but he could. He said, I should overestimate the value of this life strangely if I did not constantly bear in mind that after 30 years it will be irrelevant to me what political successes I have achieved in Europe. I can even think out the idea that someday unbelieving Jesuits will rule together with a Bonapartist absolutism. Although he was a monarchist, he often talked about the sovereignty swindle of princes. Although he used nationalism, he talked about the national swindle. A decade after German unification, he shocked some colleagues in the Foreign Office by saying, perhaps the whole approach since 1862 has been entirely wrong. The trouble about politics, he said, is you can never be certain when your policy has actually been correct. Fourth, he had an extreme ability to prioritize goals across different scales, from minutes to decades, from the appalling internal intrigues of royal courts to domestic politics and the international system, and you could see how it connected. When you trace a lot of this in detail, you see debates in Paris or London or Vienna, and you see politicians failing to decide all the time what their real priorities were. For 4 years, Vienna could not figure out if it prioritized its position in Germany or its position in Italy. It ended up losing both. It was so befuddled by the diplomatic war with Bismarck that they ended up fighting a war over Venetia, which they'd already secretly committed to abandoning, even if they won. Now, it's absolutely normal in politics for those at the apex of power to be quite clueless about their priorities. Back in 2020, often several times a day, Boris Johnson would trolley between, we've got to save lives, we've got to save the economy, we've got to save lives, we've got to save the economy. Not week to week, not even day to day, sometimes several times in one meeting. And this is really quite normal. So the impression given by the media all the time is that people are there and they've thought through and they have these goals and it's all quite clear, and then these brilliant people are actually trying to execute these goals. The reality is key people very, very often, most of the time, don't actually know what on earth their priorities are. And actually, if anyone tries to force them to form priorities, they fight very, very strongly to avoid being pinned down and actually defining them. Fifth, he had an extreme ability to adapt ways and means. He could accept that he made a mistake or the world had changed, that a plan was doomed and should be abandoned. He chased opportunities and tried to correct errors with an extreme relentlessness and a speed of action that exhausted friends and enemies. He also had an acute sense, as Richard alluded to, of when to stop. Goethe said, "Genius is knowing when to stop." And he, despite being this extraordinarily ruthless character, he also had an ability very often to stop and be modest, even at the moments of the greatest success. So having tried desperately to get the king to jump and to attack Vienna, over months and months and months of prodding and pushing and cheating and lying to get there, then after this great victory at Königgrätz, everyone suddenly around him is triumphant and wanting to march to Vienna and everything else. And he's the only person there who says, absolutely not. We're not taking anything. We don't want any Austrian territory. We have to focus on what the actual big picture and what the next moves on the chessboard are. And this kind of ability is and temperament is extremely unusual. He would often quote Virgil, "If I can't bend the heavens, then I shall move the powers of hell." And it's no surprise then that you often see in the contemporary record people referring to him as a devil. Lord Salisbury said that one has to be extremely careful with Bismarck because he's capable of things that it would be foolish to expect from anybody else in Europe. And it was quite right. He would pursue grievances to absolutely extreme ends. He drove people to the madhouse, he drove people to suicide, he drove people to death. So I think when you almost no people really learn these kind of unrecognized simplicities, and even though lots of people go through, say, 20 years of education, essentially none of it tries to train politicians and officials in what these principles are and how it's possible to think about them. Anyone can read them. I've described them in just a few minutes, but really internalizing them and then applying them hour after hour, day after day, year after year is incredibly hard. It's hard psychologically, and it's also hard because every single institution around you in politics tries to push you away from these principles. Everything has, in the civil service, in number 10, in the cabinet office, has an incentives and culture that push the exact opposite, that encourage you to believe fairy tales, that encourage overconfidence, that encourage believing your own propaganda, that encourage confused priorities, that encourage sticking to failed ideas instead of adapting, and encourage constant focus on relative trivia rather than on the most important problems. Another big lesson is that we must not confuse effectiveness and morality. We can learn an enormous amount from him, but we also have to accept the fact that in many ways he was a monster and keep these two separate things in one's mind at the same time. I'll just say something about a crucial aspect of his approach to international relations that I think is relevant to today. After 1871, he wanted peace between the great powers. He prioritized no general European war over the tribulations of minor powers and oppressed peoples. And he said repeatedly words to the effect, "I will never tie the peace of Europe to the passions of sheep stealers," referring to the Balkans. "If people don't listen," he warned, "everything we've built will be destroyed in 20 years. He often sneered at the mix of sanctimonious cant and cynical self-interest with which Britain talked about morals and principles in international conferences. After he'd gone, Germany did tie its fortunes to the passions of the Balkans and did risk a general war. It rejected his advice to stay friendly with Russia. The Germany Bismarck built was destroyed 20 years, almost to the month, after his prediction, and then European civilization went under. This question of whether and how to prioritise avoiding general war among great powers is obviously even more important today. We face the same combination of problems as Bismarck, but the scale of catastrophe has shifted from millions dead over years in Europe to billions potentially dead across the world because of decisions taken maybe only in minutes. Is it awful to see Putin invade Ukraine and thousands die? Yes, it is. But would it be thousands of times worse to see hundreds of Auschwitzes in one afternoon, and then many more Auschwitzes in coming months, with starvation and nuclear winter and poisoning? Do our politicians know how to think through these questions? No, they do not. I've sat in 2020 in underground bunkers going through these questions of nuclear weapons and all the horrific secret details, and I can tell you that our politicians have done a truly appalling job on both parties for many, many years. And the situation, you don't need to know the secret details to know how bad it is, because most of the problems are in the public domain. And what you find out when you dig in with the deep state is that everything is even worse on every level than what you can see in public. So in public, we know the early warning systems fail, that the people in charge of nuclear security are doing coke with hookers and leave the nuclear weapons unwatched on airfields and they get sent to the wrong place, etc., etc., etc. These problems constantly happen. If Bismarck were to come back to life now, I think you'd be appalled but not surprised how many intelligent people are urging politicians today not to worry about nuclear weapons. Putin's just bluffing, you see on Twitter all the time, from people in the media and from MPs. Impose no-fly zones, it'll all be okay. And I think he'd say to us, you should learn from 1914. Don't stumble into a war with Russia. Prioritise avoiding a nuclear war. Yes, the suffering of Ukraine is bad, but it could be thousands of times worse. Consider how to outlast Putin, how to shape what comes in Russia after he's gone, and be patient as you were with Stalin. There's no escape from this deadly combination. On the one hand, we have 21st century science and technology. We have 20th century bureaucracies, many of which shaped in around about 1950 after World War II, that don't work well. We have pre-1914 crisis management in all sorts of ways. In 2019, I wrote about how at the next crisis, you'd see a bunch of people, middle-aged guys with very similar education, sitting around a green base table with paper and pencil, dealing with the next crisis and how it would implode. And then I found myself less than 1 year later sitting around that green base table with exactly those guys, watching them scribble on bits of paper as Simon Stevens read out numbers, going, exponential growth, what's exponential growth? And the whole thing imploded. Fourth, we have pre-Darwinian, in lots of ways even pre-Newtonian ways of training and educating politicians. And fifth, we have Stone Age instincts that under pressure can lead very quickly to violence. Everybody in this room doubtless thinks of themselves as a good moral person, but almost everybody in this room is capable under pressure very quickly, if they feel themselves or their family threatened, of committing violence and supporting violence. And this combination of things is not sustainable in the long term. So what are the logical ways out? Well, one logical way out is that you engineer human nature itself to change, though of course that has its own very extreme dangers. You could radically change the skills of political leaders and the performance of institutions, though we find that very hard. And we also find it very hard to keep that kind of performance improvement going over time. Third, we can make some sort of transition to a world government that isn't a terrible tyranny. Or fourth, we'll just keep playing Russian roulette with weapons of mass destruction and inevitably see worse disasters than World War II and the horrors of Auschwitz. I think that studying Bismarck can help us improve the selection of people that go into politics and have crucial roles, how they're trained, the institutions that operate in these kind of crises, the incentives that they have, and also to help us think about new forms of international cooperation, without which it seems to me we are doomed. But we also have to face a terrible paradox, apparently without a solution. Improving the quality of people itself is also a terrible danger. Bismarck's partly a story of how intelligence tries very hard to escape all constraints, and all attempts by less intelligent people to force higher intelligence to align with certain goals and values are at best highly uncertain and dangerous. If we had a time machine, I think we should go back to that day in May 1866 when an assassin fired 5 bullets at him, all missed and he survived. And we should try and make sure that he is in fact dead. Without him, perhaps no World War I, Hitler, Stalin, and everything else. So on the one hand, we have this problem. Without progress in getting more people into politics who, with very high abilities in different kind of institutions, we seem to be doomed. But even if we do, perhaps that itself will be our doom. As John von Neumann said, for progress there is no cure. Thank you.
Thank you. Gideon.
So, thank you very much for inviting me. Now, the 3 speakers before me know a great deal more about Bismarck than I do. So what I thought might be useful is to focus on an issue that's come up a couple of times already, which is what Bismarck represents in contemporary politics. And it's quite surprising how often his name comes up in discussions of international affairs. I was thinking particularly one of the sort of weirdest, most interesting weeks of my journalistic career was just this February. I was at the Munich Security Conference, and it was 4 days before war was about to break out in Europe. For once, the Anglo-American intelligence community had got it right and knew what was coming. But a lot of people still, even people who'd come out of Russia and Ukraine, didn't believe it. And I remember that weekend having a discussion with a guy who was about to join the White House, in fact, about Bismarck, because they still recruit people from academia in the White House. And he said, you know, Putin is a sort of reverse Bismarck. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, Bismarck started with his very radical reconstruction of Europe, and then he became a consolidator. And Putin seems to have been, for 20 years, a relatively cautious figure. And now he's about to do this incredibly dramatic thing. And why is that? And then later on, I tried this on one of the British officials who was correctly warning what was going to happen. And this guy knew a bit about Bismarck. And he said, yeah, I think the difference, though, is that apparently Bismarck often would work himself up to a great almost hysteria at moments of great high tension. And he said, as far as I know, that is not true of Putin. But I do think that, in a sense, Putin has put us back into an age of blood and iron. And I think that my view is that Bismarck, rather than representing, as Dominic suggested, if only we could all be a bit more like Bismarck, would kind of get out of this terrible dilemma, that a lot of what Bismarck, inverted commas, represents is what Putin represents. And that there are two traditions, really, still in European politics. One of the blood and iron, the use of force, nationalism, and the other, the European Union, has been trying to get to take root, which is more internationalist and which really puts the avoidance of war right at the center of what it's trying to do. So in what way does Putin stand in the Bismarckian tradition? First of all, the absolute willingness to use war to achieve national ends. It's just part of the sheaf of things that you can pull out of the box. The second is the nature of the political ends, the national unification, and I think that is really what Putin thinks he is doing around linguistic tribe, and I think that's why my friend thought of Putin being in the Bismarckian tradition, that here is a guy who's saying, you know, there's bits of territory out there that should really be are part of our national unit, and we need to find a way of pulling them in, and if war's that way, fine. I think also Bismarck, as well as unifying Germany in the way that Putin, I guess, thinks he's unifying the Russian-speaking world, was about trying to create a new balance of power in Europe. And Bismarck did that successfully for a while, although, as we know, as we were discussing, there's a historical debate about how stable that was. And I think that is also what Putin is trying to do. He has this goal, which is about the Russian people, but he also has this belief that the balance of power in Europe is out of whack, that Russia needs to push back and use force to do it. And I think a third way in which Putin and Bismarck are surprisingly similar is in their sort of utter contempt for liberalism. Putin gives an interview actually to the FT a couple of years before all this happens, in which he talks at some length about how the liberal idea is bankrupt and it's over and so on. And Bismarck's enemies for large parts of his life are the liberals. They're the people who he has contempt for. And incidentally, Merkel actually sort of saw some of this after the annexation of Crimea. She called Putin a 19th century figure in the 21st century. And I think she meant by that almost, not exactly pitying, but that this guy was floundering around, he was out of his time. And that's where I think she got it wrong, because unfortunately he turned out not to be an anachronism, but a forerunner of the future. And one of my concerns about Ukraine is that if he succeeds, then others may be tempted to give blood and iron a chance, whether it's Xi in Taiwan or Orban in Europe, maybe Modi in India. As I say, there is this alternative tradition, which I think represented by the EU, which I think grows out of the disaster of the First and Second World Wars, and attempts to create something that doesn't see nationalism and the nation as the only relevant unit. I think Bismarck talks quite at various times about his goals, but there is a quote where he says to the Reichstag, that his only consistent principle is what is useful, effective, right for my fatherland. And the EU attempts to move beyond that. It also is about institutions and laws. I mean, the despised Brussels bureaucrats may be very annoying, but they are attempting to create a system that is not about individuals, that is not reliant on a charismatic individual to see his way through, and that may be legalistic and bureaucratic, but doesn't rely on this vision of a genius who's going to cut his way through everything. I think, Richard warned us against historical anachronism and saying, Bismarck was a man of his time and maybe it's a mistake to kind of put him in the 21st century, and I can see that. But I think that, even by the standards of his time, he was, as Dominic acknowledged, a kind of a brutal, in some ways monstrous figure. I think his biographer, Jonathan Steinberg, called him a ruthless, unprincipled warmonger. And said that one of the reasons that Bismarck found it so difficult to stabilize the system after 1870 was that people were justifiably very suspicious of him, given what he had done in the 1860s, and regarded him as somebody who stirred up war everywhere. So I guess, just to conclude, I think Dominic made a very compelling case for his genius, his political insight, but to what end? And with what means. I think that's where the Bismarckian tradition is something that's not to be really looked at with admiration, but really something we need to steer away from.
And Gideon, just staying on that point for a moment, I suppose if one tried to consider what a Bismarckian response to Putin might be, for example, that might not necessarily take us in a particularly helpful direction.
Well, I mean, Dominic has his own view. I think, Dominic, your view is that he would take a look at the balance of power and the risks and avoid nuclear war and put that as his top of his thing. I just don't know, really. I mean, obviously he was somebody who would not have a problem with going to war if he felt that was useful. Whether he would feel it was useful in these circumstances. But I think the nuclear war thing is really interesting, actually, because the guy I was mentioning, who I've subsequently seen, as far as I know, in Washington they take it very seriously. I mean, much more seriously than here. And I think find the British a bit light on this subject. Some of Liz Truss's rhetoric very over the top. No, I mean specifically.
I didn't name her the human hand grenade for nothing.
Yeah, but so that's, for example, why the Americans have decided to. But they're balancing priorities. They're not saying this is our single priority. They're trying to do several things at once, which you obviously think is a mistake. that is what's going on. So you can see, for example, in the decision of the Americans to provide the Ukrainians with this very effective artillery, but to limit the range of the missiles they're giving them to 50 kilometers. That's a sort of on the one hand, on the other, so that they can't strike inside Russia.
Yeah.
And but even they will acknowledge that's an uneasy compromise. They don't know whether Putin will take that as the signal he's intended to.
I'm interested in Bismarck's relationship to events. So Dominic read that passage. I don't know whether it was from a letter or a diary, when he talks about how he doesn't create events, he takes advantage of them. And there's a famous analogy he gives. I can't remember whether it's in your book or Steinberg's book, about God passing through human affairs, and the job of the statesman is to just clutch at his robe and be drawn through. Exactly. And there's another thing he says early in his life. I think he's been to a concert. He says he'd hate to be a musician in the orchestra. He doesn't even want to be the conductor. He wants to make the music, and that's a different idea, isn't it? So was he just being modest? Was he just playing at that attitude for reasons of his own? Did he really believe that he wasn't in control of events, and that he wasn't the kind of the progenitor of the opportunities which he was then later able to seize? Because he strikes me as a very tactical person, a very strategic person who is thinking about how he can create opportunities, not just take advantage of them when they come along. Richard and Katja, I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I mean, as I said, and that quote that you just gave there, I mean, he recognized, above all in the 60s, 1860s, that nationalism was the coming force of the future. You couldn't stop it. All over Europe, you can look at nationalism coming to power, trying to achieve power, and they keep. But you could then try and manipulate it, which is what he did. So it's often forgotten now that nationalism, which we now think of as a very right-wing authoritarian force, in the 19th century, up until the 1880s or so, it was a liberal force, because the idea of the national sovereignty involved the nation being represented by parliamentary elections with liberal institutions and so on. All of those went together. And what Bismarck, who was a dyed-in-the-wool authoritarian, did was to pull those two apart, to separate nationalism from liberalism. And time and again, he confronted liberal nationalists with the choice: choose the nation or choose your liberal principles. So he did that in 1867 to the liberals in Germany. Choose to indemnify me against, forgive me and write off all the taxes I've raised without having any parliamentary approval, because I've united the nation, or at least taken a huge step towards doing that. Or in 1878, free trade was the key doctrine in economic terms of liberals in the 19th century. So he introduced a package of measures which essentially established tariffs and import duties and regulations of all kinds in the economy. And again, he said to the liberals, look, what are you going to choose, the national interest, or are you going to choose your abstract principle of free trade? And he succeeded in separating out the two. That's not to say that there weren't forces working in favour of that anyway.
I see that.
But that he manipulated them and used them.
But in a sense, he also, what he did was also to neuter liberalism in Germany in a way that you could say had very serious consequences later, when there wasn't a kind of liberal centre. I mean, the Centre Party wasn't a liberal centre party, it was a Catholic party. There wasn't a liberal centre party when perhaps they needed it the most, or not one which had sufficient support.
Well, that's the whole problem is, which was recognised in 1940, after the Second World War, was the division of Germany into Catholic and Protestant. Protestant majority, but a very, very large Catholic minority, sort of 40%-ish. And that's why Christian democracy was founded, because the fact that you had, Catholic and Protestant Germany were at each other's throats all the time meant that you're not going to get a kind of moderate, centrist, conservative party, and that's the logic behind forming the Christian Democrats from Catholic and Protestant conservative.
So Dominic, do you see a line from Bismarck through the First World War to fascism? Is there something about Prussian militarism, his authoritarianism, the way he appealed to nationalism in the nation state that somehow provided the seeds for what was to happen 30 or 40 years later?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly that's the case. Richard that Richard alluded to earlier. I think in all sorts of ways he did prepare the ground for that. He was boundlessly cynical, and one of the methods by which he was so effective was this approach he had of constantly playing everybody off against everybody else. So he would play off the public against Parliament, Parliament against the King against other parts of the court, all of them against other foreign courts, each foreign court against itself, everybody against everybody against everybody, thinking all the time that if these forces are sort of diverted from attacking me to attacking each other, then I'm the one who ends up having this sort of freedom of action at the centre of the spider's web. And as a method, this is why I think what I was trying to say was that this is also double-edged. As a method, it's undoubtedly highly effective. There's no doubt that if you approach things like this, then you can manipulate people, you can manipulate forces, you can get what you want, but it also can be very destructive as well. And certainly the Liberals got squeezed. On the other hand, though, I think one of the other ways in which he saw how the world was changing was he made a remark, I can't remember exactly what it was, I think early 1880s, where he said state socialism is on the march, and everybody who realised this will get more power. And he thought, rightly as it turned out, that kind of classical liberals from the mid-19th century would kind of get squeezed between these very conservative forces on the one hand and this rising rising socialist forces from beneath. And he has started to develop these ideas, well, yes, okay, but maybe the socialists don't have to don't have to win, and the normal conservatives seem pretty clueless. I mean, all my Aristo mates off in the countryside don't seem to know what to do. But maybe there's a way in which the state can capture these forces. In the same way that he kind of used what he called the liberal swindle and the national swindle in the 1860s, he then thought, well, maybe I can use this new force that's coming along, but not so that they end up winning, of course, so that the monarchy ends up being stronger, etc., etc.
As Richard said, like Disraeli in a way. And they
what he
developed
did,
the
of course,
welfare
was
state and so on.
the Bismarckian welfare state, right? So he introduced, again, not a very, quite sort of against the Liberals, but he introduced all kinds of welfare measures, old age pensions, sickness insurance, all of these things to try and tame the Social Democrats at the same time as trying to repress them as well. So, and that, of course, was the beginning of a longer-term development of the welfare state in Germany, and did, in some ways, tame the Social Democrats.
Yeah, and the centre of all this power was that extraordinary precariousness that it just took one person to say, I don't want you anymore. And he was gone.
Yeah.
So
it's because he constructed the whole constitution in such a way that the monarch had enormous power, but he knew he could use that power because William I just went along with everything he wanted, and then when you get to 1890, suddenly William II says, no, I'll have all that power, I'll use it. Cheerio, Bismarck.
Okay, we probably ought to throw this open to questions. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. So we've got two here. We should have a roving mic. So the chap in the pale blue shirt.
Roving mic, yeah.
We've got about 20 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Hi. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. Message for Dominic, a question for Dominic, actually, which is, and I hope this doesn't misrepresent it, but I get the impression that you sort of subscribe to the great man of history sort of thesis in a way with Bismarck. So I was wondering what attracted you to a narcissist like Boris Johnson?
Well, as I tried to make clear, I don't wholly subscribe to that. Actually, I think, and I think in lots of ways he didn't. I think that was sort of the point, that in fact in history you have this incredibly complicated system operating where you have material forces, you have ideas, you have these things operating over decades which no one person can invent by themselves or kill by themselves. You also have all different institutions, and of course then you have individual players. But I don't. If you mean by the great man of history theory, then it's basically all about what individuals think. No, I don't think that. I think that you have all of these system things kind of jiggling against each other. But then what happens is in certain kinds of moments, certain kinds of people, often by chance, getting good luck or bad luck, can kind of nudge things out of one set of dynamics into another set. So yes, people can change things. It's not, or like the famous passages in Tolstoy's War and Peace about some sort of these billiard balls bouncing around, and it's not really about individuals. I don't think either is true. I don't think the kind of this Marxist, it's all systems view is right, and I don't think it's all a great man of history either. It's an interaction between the two. Then every now and then you can change something, but sometimes the same people try and change things and it just doesn't take.
So how did Boris Johnson become an instrument of history?
Well, because a long story, a long complicated story, but
give us a short version.
In a nutshell, because the Conservative Party completely imploded in 2019, Whitehall itself completely imploded. No one could find a way through the Gordian knot, which described a Brexit. And the Tory party thought, actually deeper than really about Brexit, they thought we could be completely finished by Christmas. The Conservative Party might be dead by Christmas, and Jeremy Corbyn could be Prime Minister, and they were on, hovering around 10, 15 points in the polls. And they thought, we don't know what to do and no one has a plan. Let's just throw our chips in on him and see what the hell happens. And in no other circumstance, I think, would Tory MPs have done it, other than the extreme circumstances of the kind of system imploding of May 2019. Certainly, I don't think anyone else in Parliament would have been crazy enough to come round to my house on Sunday before he became Prime Minister and said, no one's got a clue what to do. You've got to bring in your team and try and find some way through. But he's a gambler as well. So you had kind of two gambles. You had the Tory party gambling on Boris, and then Boris gambling on maybe this crazy team for referendum will find a way through.
Okay. Yeah, here.
Hello. First, I want to say quickly to Dominic, thank you for trying to reform the planning system. I know it didn't succeed.
Thank you for trying to reform the planning system.
Yeah. No, I'm just a property developer investor, and
Yeah, I think
it didn't go through, but it would be another boom if it went through as you envisaged in the 1930s. But anyway, that was just a side point. Where I would say I slightly disagree with you. Nobody mentioned the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And I know you'll say the codes were not there, Ukraine couldn't sustain the nukes they had, which is true. But the takeaway very much will be after this, if USA doesn't step up, UK, all the signatories. Go and arm yourself with nukes. Turkey, all other big countries, I think, after this, unless Ukraine is helped properly, I think there's even a greater risk. So I agree with the narrative of 100 Auschwitz, as you said. I totally see that, but I think the alternative, and I know on Twitter you have mentioned the 1956 Hungary, but I think there's a fundamental difference also. I may sound arrogant, you may understand it, you lived in Russia, but the difference between the Soviet Brezhnev and those people, they were statespeople. Cruel, ruthless, corrupt sometimes.
Okay, can I ask you, lots of people want to ask
Yeah, absolutely, sorry for that, yeah. But Putin is a gangster, and I don't think your vision with your approach may be the same, yeah. So.
I'm not sure that's a question. Okay. Can we, yeah, just, there's someone down here. Well, let's take two questions. And there's a guy in a pink shirt behind. So let's take this one first, and then that one. Okay, yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming on. It's been absolutely fascinating. A couple of quick things then. As we've got such a sort of distinguished panel of historians and commentators in front of us, you spoke about, everybody sort of spoke about the destabilising sort of influence of sort of Germany and the importance of Bismarck's foreign policy in preserving peace in Europe in the sort of 20 years after the unification of Germany. So I'd just like to think, reflecting on the last century, 150 years or so, without a statesman with the vision and the particular policy aims of Bismarck, is German unity fundamentally a destabilising force at the heart of Europe? And secondly, just to bring it back to Orwell, you spoke about, Katja, how sort of Orwell had completely misinterpreted what was actually going on in that scene between that French general and Bismarck. What does that speak to the inability of political commentators and writers, even of the calibre of the great George Orwell, to actually understand both history and the actual internal mechanics of politics?
Okay, from now on everyone only gets one question. So if you ask yours, we've got 3 questions to deal with. Okay.
What sort of new institution would we need to impart a Bismarckian education to future statesmen? What would that look like?
Okay, that's a good question. So the first question is German unity destabilizing? Katja?
Ask the German what she thinks. No, I don't think it is. I think it depends a little bit on what Germany wants to do with that immense power and weight that it naturally has for where it is, how big it is, what sort of economic power it is. And I don't think Germany has found the answer since 1871, and that's, I think, fundamentally the problem for a lot of the upheaval that we've seen in Europe. When Bismarck founded it, you were saying earlier about to what end, it's almost like that. Bismarck sort of grasps the idea that there's nationalism around, wars is constantly a problem in the 19th century, which, by the way, I think, we need to see Bismarck in that time as well. I think he realized that conflict with Denmark, with Austria and with France was on the card, and he was trying to manage that, in my view, rather than provoking it for the sake of it. But all of those things, I think, led to German unification because he thought that was the best way of preserving power for Prussia, not because it was a good thing in and of itself. And that effectively left Germany there without a mission other than it exists because it needed to preserve the peace between the different German states and also between Prussia and its surrounding countries. Then Bismarck goes, and you get Wilhelm, who's the first Wilhelm II, that is, who's the first ruler who's kind of grown up with Germany as a thing, as a concept. And he sees it entirely as a dynastic thing. So he is now, instead of being just the king of Prussia, he's now the Kaiser of Germany, and this is his right to further and grow. But again, it's not with a view to what does it do to Europe, what does it do to the world. And then, of course, you get the calamities of the First and the Second World Wars on a scale that it shaped Germany. And the First World War is often sort of seen as the arch catastrophe of European, but also German history. It's kind of the ur-trauma, if you will, of what Germany is now. And now Germany defines itself on the back of those two events. And again, without a view to what does it positively want to achieve, it looks to what is it trying to avoid to do in the future. Yeah. And there you're sitting there with the 4th largest economy in the world, the largest economy in Europe, not knowing what to do with that power. And as Spider-Man's uncle said, with great power comes great responsibility, and Germany doesn't really know what that responsibility is, and I don't think that conversation is finished yet. So I think I'd probably agree to some extent that there's an element there where Germany's very existence is a bit of a liability just because it doesn't know what to do with that itself, and because it hasn't quite found its place in the world.
But can I, as a non-German, just take a slightly more positive view? I think that objectively, Germany's been one of the most successful states, in the world, really. In the last decades, it's been prosperous, it's been peaceful, it's highly respected. I was just looking at the recent polling evidence. Which country do British people most trust to do the right thing in world affairs? Actually, Germany, surprisingly. So I think that this path is, as you say, it's got all sorts of problems potentially in the future, and the whole German formula, I think, is contracting out security to America and energy to Russia and exports to China. It's all it's in danger, but they've had a pretty good run with their current dispositions. And just a final thought on is German unity, is a unified Germany dangerous to peace and stability? I think the people who argue that have a sort of belief that all states kind of behave in the same way. A state is a state is a state. And John Mearsheimer, who's going through a great vogue now because of the lecture that he gave saying war was inevitable, I think is of that view. But I don't think all states behave the same way. And I think that the behaviour of modern Germany compared to the behaviour of Germany before that shows that the nature of the state, the nature of its political culture, matters enormously.
Richard?
Yeah, picking up on that, of course, as Dominic said, Bismarck knew when to stop. But he unleashed these forces, which eventually were completely uncontrollable, of German nationalism and imperialism. And Hitler did not know when to stop. In fact, his main aim was not to stop at all. His, you can look at his, I've been reading his speeches recently, God help me, and he says in 1930, his aim is to rule the world. He uses the word, Weltherrschaft. He wasn't going to stop. That's why the comparison between Hitler and Putin is wrong, because Putin has much, much more limited aims. Germany went through this period between 1933 and 45, and what it left the Germans with, I think, in political terms, was first of all, a determination not to go to war and not to become intoxicated with power. And, Katja said that we have to accept that animosity and hostility between states lasts a long time, but that's what happened with the EU and Franco-German reconciliation after 1945, because the catastrophe had been so calamitous that it ended this animosity. And the EU, in a way, is built on the reconciling this very long-term antagonism. And the second thing was Germany as a nation, in terms of foreign policy, became very afraid of power. This intoxication of power had led to a huge reluctance on the part of post-war Germany to exercise power of any kind in the international arena. As you said, contracting it out or just not doing anything. And we've seen the first tentative steps under Scholz to get over that, but it's very, very difficult. And the final thing is that after the kind of over-excitement of Hitler, Germans resolved that politicians have to be boring. And all German politicians...
They succeeded.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you tried to listen to a speech by Merkel? Which was hopeless. I've only heard two politicians who were not boring in post-war Germany. One was Franz Josef Strauss, and the other was Herbert Wehner, and they're both really kind of suspicious characters. And the problem with Britain is that we like our politicians not to be boring. And Boris Johnson has made an entire career out of being funny and interesting and not boring. It's about all he's got. He doesn't care about anything else apart from keeping on to power.
Okay. Dominic, maybe you could address the second question, which seems to be that, does the fact that Orwell may have got it wrong about Bismarck encourage you in a belief which you may or may not hold, that lots of political commentators are pretty crap?
If you want to understand what's going on in politics, definitely do not read the general pundits in mainstream newspapers. I mean, of course, some of them are okay, and of course, some of them write things that are okay. But overall, it's close to 100% noise, and increasingly actively misleading if you want to actually understand things. So I think useful information tends to be on the edge. It's not in mainstream publications, almost entirely, I would say.
Did you want to say anything about German unity?
No, I mean, I pretty much agreed with
Okay.
with everything that Katja and Richard said. On the other, I mean, I think we should not necessarily be upset that Germany is so boring now. Maybe we're okay if it stays boring. Personally, I'm okay if it stays boring for a while.
Yeah.
And revving up Germany v Russia again doesn't seem to me like a good idea either.
The final question was about some sort of academy for statesmen, some sort of international academy. I'm not quite sure of that, but you're quite keen on people in Whitehall and Westminster
very
having
quickly
different
there.
skills.
If you want to learn from the past, you have to make sure that governments and universities do not close down history departments across the country.
Well, I agree with that. So you're keen on people in Westminster and Whitehall having different skills from the ones they have?
Yes, I mean, I think that I read Ancient World History. I think it was fantastic. I mean, I read things about classical Athens, and I read about people like Bismarck. But I think that if you're actually training people to go and make decisions on war and peace and nuclear weapons and things like that, you really need training programs that are broader, that get different kinds of skills, both intellectual skills, in the sense of people who are more quantitative, but also much more practical skills. One of the great problems with Westminster is that everyone wants to do policy, and even more the dread word strategy, but they're the high status things. What's completely low status is actually doing things, actually operationally being competent, actually being able to run something. And over again, I had arguments inside Whitehall about this, where there's some airy-fairy character put in charge of some extremely operational thing. They haven't got a clue what on earth they're doing. They could no doubt get a first if they did a history essay at Oxford or Cambridge, but completely clueless about actually, say, running the border system. And this is a huge problem in Whitehall, where actually real operational competence is a low status thing, and you saw that enormously and tragically in the COVID disaster, where you had a whole set of people in critical jobs in Number 10, the Cabinet Office, Department of Health and elsewhere, who simply couldn't actually get things done. So extreme that, for example, in mid-March, I was calling around and having meetings in Number 10 with people like former commanding officer of the SAS, who we had to literally get into the Department of Health to sort out testing. Because, of course, if you're the commanding officer of the SAS, you actually can go in and get all kinds of stuff done very, very quickly and very, very competently. But the people nominally in charge of this in crucial parts of the bureaucracy were completely hopeless, fell apart, went home. And this is not discussed. And now, even after 150,000 people are dead, you don't really see any discussion in Whitehall or in the media about these kind of things.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end there. I'm sorry for people who wanted to ask questions because it's 8:30. I wanted to thank a couple of people in the Orwell Foundation office, which is Jordan Dilworth and James Tookie, who've done an enormous amount of work putting this festival together and putting tonight together, and Liz Wallace, our Deputy Director, who's here. Jean Seaton's not here. I forgot to thank the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who are also our sponsors, and I forgot to introduce myself. I'm chair of the, my name's Ken MacDonald, I'm chair of the trustees of the foundation, and on behalf of the trustees, I'd like to thank the wonderful panel. It's been the most brilliant, insightful discussion and from all of you, without exception, so thank you all very much indeed. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Before you go,